So the final video of our chapter 4 series is going to be about semi-autonomous organelles. So in particular, those semi-autonomous organelles will be the mitochondria as well as the chloroplast. So let's look at the word semi-autonomous first. Let's break it down, and I'm going to help you realize you kind of know what this means. So semi means half. We've seen that word before. Auto kind of means on your own. So think of it like that. So something that might be automatic is going to run on its own, it's going to operate on its own. Semi means half. So if you think about it, it's like independent to a degree. It can kind of operate on its own, but it does need some assistance. So if you're thinking of your life, think of you as a teenager, right? You as a teenager, you're going to be somewhat independent, but you still might rely on mom and dad a little bit to get things done, right? So that's a good way to think of it. So for this particular or these particular organelles, because they are semi-autonomous, that means they are independent to a degree, and they can actually grow and divide on their own, which is much different than everything else we've talked about. They have the ability to grow, divide, and reproduce themselves because they contain their own genetic material. So like I said, they're not completely autonomous. They do need to rely on the host or on the eukaryotic cell to be able to complete their synthesis. So it's like they have the factory, but they don't have all the parts, right? So this is just a combination and just another way to describe something that is semi-autonomous. So the first semi-autonomous organelle is the mitochondria. Within the mitochondria, you can always identify it. It looks like a little oval or a little kidney bean. Mitochondria is found in all eukaryotes, but not found in prokaryotes. So our bacteria do not have mitochondria. Most of your cells are going to contain hundreds of mitochondria, and even some cells will contain thousands. So depending on the function of the cell, if it is used to doing a lot of activity, so like for instance a muscle cell, that cell will have more mitochondria because it needs to produce some more energy, as opposed to something like an adipocyte, which is like a fat cell, maybe on your belly. It's just kind of sitting there. It doesn't really use a lot of energy, so that one may not have as much. Mitochondria have a lot of membranes. That's going to allow different features to happen and increases the surface area. And another cool thing about mitochondria is they contain some circular DNA. So you see that here in purple. And you get this DNA from your maternal side or your mother. So you actually have more genetic information to mirror your mother than your father, just because some things like the mitochondria, that DNA actually comes purely from the mother. Although there's the DNA in mitochondria, we don't have any nucleuses present. All right, so one of the primary roles of the mitochondria is it is there to convert glucose to ATP, right? So we're able to take that glucose, make it ATP, and we'll talk all about that in Module 3. Some secondary roles is that it can make some of our cellular molecules, and also it generates heat. So imagine like any other factory or engine, as it continues to produce energy, it's going to give off a little bit of heat. So some organisms like polar bears, they have very high amounts of mitochondria to keep them warm in those frigid temperatures. The chloroplast, this is kind of that equivalent in plants. So let's talk about the chloroplast. We find the chloroplast in plants and in algae. So both algae, which you find in the water, and plants, which we know are going to contain chloroplasts. The chloroplasts have their signature green color because of a pigment called chlorophyll. So the pigment is called chlorophyll, and that pigment makes up or allows the chloroplast to be green. That green color and the structure itself is important for being able to capture light energy so that plants can create glucose. That entire process is called photosynthesis. So that's a main feature of the chloroplast. I want to bring another theory into the context because, this is what we've been talking about. One of the theories is something called endosymbiosis theory. And the concept here is that a long time ago, there were very primitive bacteria, and those primitive bacteria somehow interacted with a large cell. It was a little simple at the time, but they interacted with that cell. When that happened, you started having this complex cell that had the bacteria present. So if you remember us talking about horizontal gene transfer, where we talked about how it's very rare, but it does happen, this is what scientists believe happened with the mitochondria and with the chloroplast. We think billions of years ago, the mitochondria and the chloroplast, because they have their own DNA, because they're kind of independent, they probably were more like bacteria. Somehow they got incorporated inside of a eukaryotic animal cell or plant cell, and that caused a really good relationship between the new cell and the former bacteria, right? So then we ended up developing them into the eukaryotic cells we have today. So that's a theory, endosymbiosis theory, but it does combine a concept that we talked about earlier in the semester. So, this is a continuation of the previous videos in which we talked about all of these different parts of the factory, and the mitochondria and the chloroplast will kind of represent our generator. So, one of the final components of the cell is the ECM and cell wall. So, cells are going to secrete this external material, and it kind of forms this squishy network or meshwork outside of the cell's membrane. So, if you think about a cell membrane here, then there's this external kind of matrix or a complex of material that you can sometimes find outside of cells. So in our plants and our bacteria, that external material is called a cell wall, and in animals we call that an ECM or extracellular matrix. So the extracellular matrix is a very complex network. Again, you're going to have a cell membrane that's on the top on this picture, and then all of the ECM is going to be kind of this squishy network outside. So the ECM has two major roles. One is protection. So your skin has a big ECM component. Cartilage, that's really important. Think of your knees and your joints, that squishy cartilage that when you run a mile, your knees don't rub together. That is going to be made of extracellular matrix. Some diseases or disorders like arthritis, that's when you start to wear down on that cartilage and your knees or your joints rub together, the bones. That is going to be because that cartilage is not there. And then even around your organs, a lot of organs are coated in a material that kind of helps them to stay protected in case, you have some type of trauma in your body. Hopefully you can protect those valuable organs. And then structural support. So items such as bones in your body and peptidoglycans we've talked about before. This is going to be very critical, and they're going to be comprised of that extracellular matrix. The cell wall, as I mentioned, is going to be very flexible but strong. It's made up of multiple layers, and those layers are comprised of cellulose, which we know is one of our polysaccharides we discussed earlier. Very important to note that cell walls are found in plants, fungi, and bacteria, but they are never found in animals. So if you have a question in which you identify a cell wall is present, you know that you're not looking at an animal cell. So this wraps up the video, and this actually wraps up the content for chapter 4. If there's anything you didn't understand from this video or the previous ones, please take time to review it. That's going to make a big difference in your learning for the course.